Okay, as we've already alluded to, we're going through the book of Job, so open to Job chapter 30, and then we're going to spend most of our morning in chapter 38, when God speaks. But Job, as I started by saying when we began the series, is a story that begins with the assumption that we, like Job, will all go through difficult times. We will all have problems, we'll all have trouble. I've titled this morning, though, "The Sun Always Rises," because sometimes we forget that in the middle of the darkest night, the sun will rise again. There is hope. But just to establish that we are all on common ground, if you've ever had a problem in your life, at any time, if you've ever had a problem, could you raise your hand? Could I see the hands? All right, a few dishonest people are not raising their hands. All right, how about this? How about if you have a problem right now, even if it's something small and nagging you, if you have a problem right now, all right, that's at least half of us have something. All right, look to the person sitting next to you. If it looks like they have a problem, could you raise your hand, because maybe they weren't being honest and maybe they do have a problem. And then last question, if the person sitting next to you is your problem, could I go ahead and raise your hand? And you guys can work this out later, but it's good to know we have that out in the open. Yeah. But it's true, we all have days, weeks, months, sometimes years of what many describe as a dark night. So I want to start with that premise, is that we all end up in dark places. Job says it like this. This is Job chapter 3, verse 25. "The worst of my fears have come true. What I dreaded most has happened." And so today, I don't want to try to do the thing that a lot of people do, and that's try to answer the question, why has God allowed the worst thing to happen to me? But I want to talk today about what happens on these most difficult, dark nights of what I'll describe the dark night of the soul, or as the theologian and thinker St. John of the Cross said hundreds of years ago, the dark night of the soul. God is doing something in us. God is working something in us. And we all end up, even when we end up in dark places. So I want to start in chapter 30, and just so you can be reminded of where Job is, verse 26. Job writes or says this, I looked for good, but evil came instead. I waited for the light, but darkness fell. My heart is troubled and restless. Days of suffering torment me. I walk in gloom without sunlight. I stand in the public square and cry for help. My harp plays sad music. Can it get any worse than this? And so Job, do you see why I say Job is in the middle of the darkest night? If someone asks you, what was the darkest night you've been on? Maybe one doesn't jump out for you. But for me, when someone says, what was the darkest night you've been through? I know exactly when it was. I write about a night when I was in the north of Tanzania. We had driven, I had 3 college students in my van and my son Byron, and we drove for 3 days. We finally get to the border to Kenya. We're trying to get into Kenya, and it's 11:30 at night. And the border guard looks at our paperwork and he says, you don't have the right documents. You need to call someone in the long way and get it. And I said, it's 11:30 at night. He said, I know. I said, well, where am I supposed to sleep? Because picture this, we're in this town called Namaga. Namaga is probably the most dusty, dilapidated, broken down town I've seen anywhere in Africa. There's a few street vendors, a couple of shacks that are serving as bars, and a bunch of lorry drivers sleeping under their trucks. And I said, where am I supposed to sleep? He said, in your van. I said, great. So I go back out to the 3 college students and my son Byron, who are in the van, and I'm sharing the bad news with them. We're going to sleep in the van tonight. And there's mosquitoes everywhere. And then a guy comes up, a Tanzanian comes up, and he says, do you need help? And I look at him, and we had been shooing away all the vendors that were trying to sell us batteries and chiclets, cigarettes, and jumper cables. And I started to shoo him away, but then I noticed his ears. His ears were tied in a knot. And I said, are you a Maasai? He said, how'd you guess? I said, because your ears are tied in a knot. And so but he didn't look like a Maasai, because most Maasai are tall. He was short. Most Maasai wear this plaid red what would you call it, some kind of shroud that they wrap around their shoulder. He's in jeans and a t-shirt and flip-flops, but he says he's a Maasai, and he says he can help. I said, well, is there anywhere we can sleep? He said, yes, there's a beautiful resort just on the other side of the border. Your van has to stay here, but we can walk there. And I go, okay, I think we'll go. And so we had 2 volunteer to stay in the van, volunteered, and so they stayed behind with the mosquitoes to watch our stuff. And the rest of us followed the Maasai. And we go literally under the bar that's the gate to Kenya. We start walking down this road. It's getting darker and darker. I turned to John, who's with me, and I said, John, do you have a knife? Because I know the guy carries a knife everywhere. He loves weapons. He wanted to be a Navy SEAL. He takes a knife to McDonald's. He says, no, I don't have my knife. I go, what are you thinking? We're going to get jumped because it's getting darker. It's nothing but bush. And I say, hey, Maasai, where's this resort? He says, oh, just down the road. Just keep following me. I said, but I don't see the lights or anything. He said, the generator must be out. I said, convenient, isn't it? So we get jumped in the dark. So anyway, I'll end the story later. I'll come back to this, and we'll just pause there. So Job, my point is, Job has a night like this. In Job 23, look at this. We read, I'm completely in the dark. I can't see my hand in front of my face. Job 19:8, we read, he's turned out the lights. I'm stuck in the dark. Like I said, the 15th century theologian, writer, and writer St. John of the Cross calls it La Noche Oscura, in Latin for the dark night of the soul. And maybe you've been through the dark night of the soul when you doubt God because so much trouble is in your life, when you want to give up. Maybe you're going through the dark night of the soul right now. Maybe it's disappointment with God that has put you there. Maybe it's unanswered prayer that's put you there. Maybe it's an addiction that's put you in the dark night of the soul. Maybe it's a rebelling son or daughter. Maybe it's an unfaithful husband or wife. Maybe it's a dishonest business partner that has put you in this place. Maybe it's financial failure. Maybe someone has broken your heart. But the truth is, we all end up on those dark nights. But I'm here this morning to remind you that the sun always rises, that there's always hope. And Job says it like this. This is Job 3, verse 9. He says, I'm waiting for a daylight that never comes. And even though, maybe this is you right now, I want to say this as we start this morning, that even when life feels dark, I want to remind you that in my opinion, from my observation, God does some of his best work in our lives on what I'll describe as a dark canvas. God does his best work, I have on the screen, on dark canvas. That's why if you look around the room, our artists, we've asked them all to start with a dark canvas. Usually a canvas is white. By the way, can we just pause and thank them for their art? This is stunning and beautiful. And I can't wait till the end of the morning to see what they have. But normally we think a canvas should be white, but not dark. I think I was first convinced that you could have beautiful art on a black canvas when I was in Tijuana, Mexico. And that's where it happened. I was there during college. I'd gone down with my twin brother and some other guys from Biola University. And most of us are buying ponchos and switchblade combs, right, and firecrackers. But my twin brother sees a painting on black velvet of Jennifer Beals. Some of you old enough to remember Jennifer Beals. Flashdance. Okay, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so he sees the painting and he buys it. And I'm mocking him. I'm saying, that's not really art. That's a white painting on black velvet, but he hangs it in our room, and it's mesmerizing. I'm just laying in bed, and I want to marry someone like Jennifer Beals. And I did. And, I thought I did. So, and then we had it in our room for a couple of months, and someone older than us comes in our room, and he says, why do you have a picture of Raquel Welch in your room? We're going, that's not Raquel Welch. It was Raquel Welch. He's been laughing at us. My brother takes it down. He's very embarrassed about this, so don't bring it up when you see him. It's rather disappointing. But I think there's something there that God can do something stunning in our lives, even on those dark nights of the soul. I think God, and I have this thought on the screen, that God is doing something good, even beautiful. He's doing something new and unique in our lives, even when life feels so dark. Most of you have heard of Vincent van Gogh. And my favorite piece, maybe his most famous piece, I don't know, is titled Starry Night. And I don't know if you know how or when Starry Night was painted. Well, first I'll say this. I have a print of Starry Night here. And what happened is my wife, I just want you to know it's not the original. Some of you might think it is. But my wife and I are in New York City. And she tells me, this was some years ago, she says, hey, Starry Night is in MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. Can we go see it? So we go to MoMA. And who knew? They want $35 a person to get in. So I'm like stalling. I'm like, $35, $70. So I see there's a gift shop right there by the ticket counter, and I see they have posters for sale. And I look, it's $9. So I say, for $61, we could just buy, I can buy the poster for $9. We have $61 to go out to dinner tonight, and somehow convince her that was okay. Can I just say, guys, husbands, don't be so cheap. Don't be cheap like Palmer was. So anyway, so I bought her the poster, and we hung it in our house, and now it hangs in our office. But I never did get to see the original. She still won't let me forget this. We'll do it next time we're in New York. So whenever that is. So Vincent van Gogh paints this when he's in an insane asylum in the south of France in Saint Remy. He's there because his brother thinks he's losing his mind, which might have been happening. He had cut off his ear, and he walked down the street and gave it to a young woman and said, take care of this and be careful with it. And so maybe he was going mad. Sue him for that. Not everybody does that. So his brother puts him in the asylum, and at night he can look out through his window and see the town down the hill below. And so he paints it. And so in the dark of night, he's painting Saint Remy at night, but it's one of the most stunning pictures because it looks like daylight. And so at night he shows, look at the imagery, he shows the village as really small. And you start to realize that the things that are made by people, by humans, he makes them small and insignificant. He paints the windows of the chapel black and dark because the church has excommunicated him because they don't like his art. But everything made by God is enormous. Some people thought it was bad art because everything's so out of proportion. But he makes this huge swirling moon and stars and clouds, and then the evergreen is growing. Do you see the picture he's painting, that on this dark night in Saint Remy, on his dark night of the soul, maybe God is growing something good in him. And my point is, that's what God is maybe doing in you, and that's why I say God does some of his best work on dark canvas. And I don't think I'm just making that up, because when you think about the way the Bible story opens, right? We have in Genesis a story of a black void universe, and God throws in some light, and then he throws in some color. And even today, when NASA scientists send a strobe out into space, or a satellite, and they send it hundreds of thousands of miles into space, they have it turn around and take a picture of Earth. Do you know what the scientists say? They say it looks like a sapphire. They call Earth the jewel of the universe. And my point is that God even painted this earth on a black canvas. And so, as I said a moment ago, I believe God uses dark nights to shape us in new ways, in good ways, sometimes in even beautiful ways. Listen to what Job says. This is Job chapter 12, verse 22. He uncovers mysteries hidden in darkness. He brings light to the deepest gloom. I want to say this next, because this is where we are in our story of Job. We come to chapter 38. And I want to remind you this morning that on the dark nights of the soul, God is speaking. I think one of the great charges that people for centuries have brought against God when we're going through the worst things is people say, God is silent. God, you're not answering my prayer. God, do you even hear me? And then we read in Job chapter 38, we read these words, and God speaks. So here's what God says. And he's coming back at Job, and he says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. I don't think he was happy. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" He says, "Job, you don't know what you're talking about. You're accusing me of being silent." I think there's several important things that God says to Job on Job's dark night that he's also saying to you and me. The first one that I think God is saying to Job is, "Job, trust me." And so we read this. Let's move down to verse 4. He says, Job, he's trying to explain to Job, that trust me, I know what I'm doing. Where were you, Job, when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand who's marked off its dimensions. Surely you know who stretched a measuring line across it. On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? Maybe the book of Job is right in the middle of the Bible to remind us when things are really bad that God can be trusted. And then the next thing I think God is saying to Job and to all of us is, I'm in control of it all. And so he keeps going here. He says to Job, verse 31, can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? Can you bring forth the constellations in their season, or lead the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your hand to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you and say, here we are? And then in chapter 41, God keeps speaking, and he says this in verse 11. He says, I'm in charge of it all. And then he says, I run the universe. How do you like that? I love those words. I think we try to be in control of it all, but God wants us to know that he is in control of it all. And then I think God says this next. I believe he says, have resolve and don't look back. Because I'm convinced that when life gets really tough, all of us want to look back, turn back, go back to where we were before. We want to give up on what's happening, and God is saying, have resolve and be strong. Job is not the only person in the Bible, do you know, that God tests. God tests, for example, Abraham. If you know the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah finally have a son. They name him Isaac. They name him, which means laughter, because they're laughing so much at having a new son. And then God says the most absurd thing to test Abraham. We read this in Genesis chapter 22. We read, God tested Abraham. And he says, let me turn back. And he says, take your son, verse 2, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So the son who he loves, he says, walk. And we read it's a 3-day walk. And so Abraham starts this 3-day walk to sacrifice his son. Soren Kierkegaard he dubs Abraham the knight, that's with a K, the knight of the absurd, because it's an absurd walk. Who would walk for 3 days to sacrifice your son? You talk about 3 dark days and 3 dark nights. But Abraham keeps walking, he keeps enduring, he keeps persevering, he keeps trusting. My brother-in-law, his name is Marty, he runs marathons. And he doesn't just do 26 or whatever those are mile marathons. He does ultra marathons. There are 100-mile marathons. I said, Marty, how in the world do you run 100 miles? He says, Palmer, you just keep running. You just tell yourself you can't stop. And I said, well, you're going to die. And he almost did. Anyway, I was watching Lance Armstrong, who at one time was considered the greatest cyclist in the world. He had just won a stage in the Pyrenees. And the Pyrenees are steeper than the Alps. And they said, Lance, how did you do it? At your age, how did you do it? He's in his late 30s when he did it. And he said, you know what? The younger guys quit and give up. The younger guys, when the mountain gets painful, they think their body's going to fail. But as we get older, we realize if you just endure, if you just keep pedaling, he says, you'll make it. You don't have to give up. You don't have to turn around. He says, just keep pedaling. Endure. He said, and then get a shot of anabolic steroids. And then just keep pedaling and keep going. And that was his advice. All right, I made some of that up. But that's the lesson here. And so listen to this. So Abraham doesn't just endure, but it's an absurd endurance. And then we read this in verse 7, Genesis chapter 22. Isaac said, Isaac's young, small kid, but he's a smart kid. Hey, the fire and the wood are here. He can do the math. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham speaks these famous words, God will provide the sacrifice. When life turns dark, my encouragement to you is to look forward and stop looking back. We often think it was better before. Maybe we've moved from another state, and we think maybe the last job was better before. It wasn't better. You can't go back. And I want to say, keep looking forward. Endure. In the trouble, keep looking forward. You can't go back. Going back to the Kenya story, we're walking along, and now the dark in Egypt, we've turned down this small dirt road, and it was dark before it. Now it's dark as a crypt. I really, literally couldn't see the hand in front of my face. And so I stopped the Messiah, and I said, hey, Messiah, we're going back, because I'm sure we're going to get jumped now. And the Messiah says, no, trust me. There's a beautiful resort. He says, trust me. And everything in me wanted to trust him, but he was too short, and he had on a t-shirt and jeans instead of the red plaid robe, and he didn't have a spear or a machete. And I turned to John, I says, we got to go back. And John says, Palmer, just trust him. And I want to trust him. Everything in me wants to trust him. So I said, okay, and I just kept looking at his ears for hope, like he really is Messiah. Messiah are known for their courage and their character, and so I thought, okay, we'll trust him, and so we keep walking, and then I see a wall, and I realize the resort is just inside that wall. That's the wall of the resort, and now I'm feeling hopeful, but then all of a sudden, I see a shadow move out of the corner of my eye, and from behind a tree, a guy starts coming towards us, and he's coming fast, and he has a spear, I'm not making this up, a spear in his left hand, and a machete in his right, and my thought was, we're going to die, and so I jumped behind John, and he'll die. I'll finish the story in just a minute. We're going to come back to it. And because that's where Abraham is, and so we read that Abraham, is in the valley of what the Hebrew people, Jewish people call the valley of darkness. So in Genesis chapter 22, verse 4, we read, on the third day, Abraham looked up and he saw Mount Moriah in the distance. So if you know anything about the topography of Jerusalem, it's surrounded by three valleys. The largest and most prominent and the longest valley and the deepest valley is the Kidron Valley. Kidron in Hebrew means darkness or dark place. When David talked about walking through the valley of the shadow of darkness, the valley of the shadow of death, he's talking about walking through Kidron. Kidron became the burial place of the people of Jerusalem. It's filled with tombs, and they would bury their dead there. Jeremiah talked about the dead people's bones in this valley. In John chapter 18, we read Jesus walks through the Kidron Valley, and he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, his darkest place where he's betrayed, and then he's crucified. So everyone, and what most people maybe haven't heard is or know is that today most theologians say that Mount Moriah is the same ridge, the same place where modern-day Jerusalem sits. And so that's where Abraham goes. So he's down in the Kidron Valley looking up at Mount Moriah. In my opinion, everything in him wanted to turn around and go back. But Abraham has resolve, and he keeps walking. And he says to his son, like I said earlier, God will provide the sacrifice. I want to say one last thing this morning, and that God is saying in the dark nights, and it's this, that I am growing something good and new in you. Turn over a page, one more page, so go back to Job, and we get to Job chapter 42, and we read this. Job answers back to God, and he says, I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours is thwarted. Verse 6, I repent in dust and ashes. Do you see how Job's dark night finally becomes his place of repentance? So Abraham, going back to that story, he finds the ram in the bushes, right? God stops him from killing his son, and he finds the ram, and he sacrifices the ram. Do you know most Hebrew scholars will say that sacrifice was to make right what he had done to Hagar and Ishmael? If you know about the story, he had sent Hagar into the desert to die, where she says to God, she says, God, please see me. Your name is El Roi, the God who sees. And he tried to kill her, and her son Ishmael sends him out. And so this sacrifice on the top of Mount Moriah was Abraham's sacrifice to right what was wrong in his life. And finally, here we read that Job, on his darkest nights, asked for forgiveness. And so my point is that maybe in life's darkest nights is when we finally turn back to God and say, I was wrong, and we ask him to make it right in our own lives. Proverbs 20, verse 30 reads, sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways. When I think about Abraham offering this sacrifice on a mountain, it reminds me of a Sunday we had at the Grove, of all things. So it was the first time we have a wooden cross over here, and when we're meeting in this other building, we brought the wooden cross on the stage. And the plan was we put a blue index card on everyone's seats, and I invited everyone. On that Sunday, we're talking about the wrong, the sin in our lives, and I said, if there's something that you want to confess, then write it on the card that you need forgiveness of. Write it there, and you can nail it to the cross, and that's where Jesus says you're forgiven. When we were planning this, my staff said, Palmer, no one's going to get out of their chair with a sin on their hand, on a blue card, and go nail it on the cross. And so with that kind of encouragement, we kept planning the Sunday, and we put the cards out on the chairs. And sure enough, when I invited people to bring their sins on a blue index card and nail it to a cross, one young lady came by herself and nails it. And then it seemed like the auditorium emptied. And for 3 services, it seemed like everyone there came and nailed something they needed to confess, something they needed to be forgiven of on the cross. And it was just covered in blue cards. Well, the morning was over, and I was about to go home, and a nice young woman came up, and she has a Ziploc bag, and she says, here, Palmer, and it's full. She says, here are everyone's cards with their sins on it. So I didn't think it was actually going to work, so we hadn't planned this far ahead. Like, what do I do with the sins now? So I took all the sins in the Ziploc bag, and I put them in my backpack, and I said, thank you for giving these to me, for the many sins. And I took them to my office, and I just left the backpack there because I didn't know what to do with them. I came back Monday, and I thought maybe I'll put them in the recycle bin, but that felt like more like recycling sin than actually forgiving anything. So I left them in the backpack for several weeks, and then we had planned a trip to Sinai. So I took my backpack home to pack, and I thought, you know what, I'll just take them with me to Egypt. Maybe I'll know what to do with these in Egypt. And so I took them on the plane, and we get to the Red Sea, Sharm el-Sheikh, and we spend the night on the Red Sea. And I got up early in the morning, I couldn't sleep, and I took my backpack out, and I thought, I'm going to throw these in the Red Sea. And then I thought, man, that's just littering. It's a beautiful ocean. I'm just going to litter it with all these cards. So I went back to my room, threw in a couple of bottles of water, and we went to Mount Sinai and started to hike and climb. And it's about a 4-hour climb, and we had a Bedouin guide. And about halfway up, we're just talking about Mount Sinai, and the Bedouin guide says this. He says, the Hebrew people call this the Mount of Forgiveness. I said, they call it what? He says, the Mount of Forgiveness. I said, I've never heard that. He said, sure. He said, when Moses came down with the first set of 10 commandments and the people were worshiping an idol, he broke it. And when he went back up, he had to ask God to forgive the people. And God did. And so the Hebrew people call this the Mount of Forgiveness. So I knew the backpack that I was carrying on my back I was carrying it to the right place. And it just got heavier, all the way up. It took us hours. We don't get there till it's dark. It's pitch black dark. We get to the top of Mount Sinai. And there's a small chapel there, smaller than this stage. And Veronica and I went around the back to kind of find shelter from the wind. And when I get there, a bunch of the Bedouin guides are sitting around a fire. And so I sat down next to them, and they're just trying to stay warm. It's pretty cold, and it's dark. And I sat down, and I said, hey, could I burn something in your fire? And they're like, do what? I said, can I burn something in your fire? And they said, sure. And so I took out the Ziploc bag with hundreds and hundreds of sins written on them, and Veronica and I fed the fire. And then it felt so freeing to watch them turn into ashes and float and disappear into the night sky. And that's why I say that maybe on the darkest nights of our life, that if there's something that hasn't come out when the sun is shining and the skies are blue, that it's on the dark nights we finally say, okay, God, I'm going to let go. I need you, like Job did finally say, okay, God, I need your forgiveness, or like Abraham does. And so I'll end by just reading what Job says in Job 11:17. Zophar, actually, his friend, says, your life will be brighter than the new day. Even darkness will be as bright as morning. In the Psalms, David writes, weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. How do you like that? So just to finish the story in Namaga, Kenya, the guy's coming from behind the tree, right? He has a spear and a machete. And I swear on my mother, that's exactly what's going on. And then our Maasai guy yells, he goes, hey, that's my uncle. And I was like, oh, good. And he says, he's the night watchman. And he's also, it turns out, was the receptionist for the small hotel. So he gets us a key, goes inside, gets us a key, and he walks us to our room, and he says, that'll be $25. And I was like, oh, hang on. I said, it's like 12:30 at night now. Half the night is gone. How about 20? John, who should have been armed, he says, Palmer, pay the man. Pay the man. He's got a machete and a spear. So we paid him the 25. I finally fell asleep on this night that just wouldn't end. It was like a nightmare. And I woke up the next morning at dawn, and I went out, and the Maasai was right. It's one of the most beautiful resorts I'd seen anywhere in Africa. There's a swimming pool, there's jungle surrounding it, and you can see Mount Kilimanjaro off in the distance. And the Maasai was right. And so my point simply is that the sun always rises, is that there's always hope. We worship a God who's a God of hope. And so don't give up. Even when everything in life wants to make you give up, don't give up.